Hello. The seventh essay in The Art of Literature is titled On Some Forms of Literature, and like the essay on the study of Latin and that on Men of Learning, it has been composed by the translator and editor T. Bailey Saunders from excerpts of 4 different sections of Schopenhauer's later work, Perurga. In this first section, we'll hear Schopenhauer talk about the character of drama. He'll make some observations about drama as an artistic genre, its ambitions, and what makes it excellent. And he'll give us some thoughts about ways in which art, the novel especially, is better and superior the more it focuses upon inwardness instead of outwardness in the characters. Here's what Schopenhauer writes. In the drama, which is the most perfect reflection of human existence, there are 3 stages in presentation of the subject, with a corresponding variety in the design and scope of the piece. At the first, which is also the most common stage, the drama is never anything more than merely interesting. The persons gain our attention by following their own aims, which resemble ours. The action advances by means of intrigue and the play of character and incident, while wit and raillery season the whole. At the second stage, the drama becomes sentimental. Sympathy is roused with the hero, and indirectly with ourselves. The action takes a pathetic turn, but the end is peaceful and satisfactory. The climax is reached with the third stage, which is the most difficult. There, the drama aims at being tragic. We are brought face to face with great suffering and the storm and stress of existence, and the outcome of it is to show the vanity of all human effort. Deeply moved, we are either directly prompted to disengage our will from the struggle of life, or else a chord is struck in us which echoes a similar feeling. The beginning, it is said, is always difficult. In the drama, it is just the contrary. For these, the difficulty always lies in the end. This is proved by countless plays which promise very well in the first act or 2, and then become muddled, stick, or falter, notoriously so in the 4th act, and finally conclude in a way that is either forced or unsatisfactory, or else long foreseen by everyone. Sometimes, too, the end is positively revolting, as in Lessing's Emilia Galotti, which sends the spectators home in a temper. This difficulty in regard to the end of a play arises partly because it is everywhere easier to get things into a tangle than to get them out again, partly also because at the beginning we give the author carte blanche to do as he likes, but at the end make certain definite demands upon him. Thus we ask for a conclusion that shall be either quite happy or else quite tragic, whereas human affairs do not easily take so decided a turn, and thus we expect that it shall be natural, fit, and proper, unlabored, and at the same time foreseen by no one. These remarks are also applicable to an epic and to a novel, but the more compact nature of the drama makes the difficulty plainer by increasing it. Ex nihilo nihil fit. That nothing can come from nothing is a maxim true in fine art as elsewhere. In composing an historical picture, a good artist will use living men as a model, and take the groundwork of the faces from life, and then proceed to idealize them in point of beauty or expression. A similar method, I fancy, is adopted by good novelists. In drawing a character, they take a general outline of it from some real person of their acquaintance, and then idealize and complete it to suit their purpose. A novel will be of a high and noble order the more it represents of inner and the less it represents of outer life, and the ratio between the two will supply a means of judging any novel of whatever kind, from Tristram Shandy down to the crudest and most sensational tale of knight or robber. Tristram Shandy has indeed as good as no action at all, and there is not much in La Nouvelle Héloïse and Wilhelm Meister. Even Don Quixote has relatively little, and what there is, very unimportant and introduced merely for the sake of fun. And these 4 are the best of all existing novels. Consider further the wonderful romances of Jean-Paul, and how much inner life is shown on the narrowest basis of actual event. Even in Walter Scott's novels, there is a great preponderance of inner over outer life, and incident is never brought in except for the purpose of giving play to thought and emotion, whereas in bad novels, incident is there on its own account. Skill consists in setting the inner life in motion with the smallest possible array of circumstance, for it is this inner life that really excites our interest. The business of the novelist is not to relate great events, but to make small ones interesting. Dramatic works, Schopenhauer tells us, may be either interesting or sentimental or tragic. In the lower forms of drama, we find things that are much more immediately interesting and satisfying to us, that they appeal to something rather shallow in us. Think of our love of spectacle in the cinema, for example, today. They may be very action or plot driven, so the interesting elements of them are right there on the surface. A higher type of drama engages our sentimental and emotional faculties. It will engage us emotionally and cause us to feel things, but it will still present us with a satisfying ending. So we leave the theater feeling that we've had a satisfying emotional experience. The highest and best kind of drama, Schopenhauer says, is the tragic, which disturbs us at a very deep level, and it leaves us in an important way unsatisfied, because it confronts us with the tragedy of existence in a way that's inescapable, that moves us very deeply, and either directly or indirectly invites us to rise above the suffering of this world, to disengage our will, to invest ourselves more fully in our intellect and our ability to overcome the suffering of this world without being able to fully escape it. So there's a way in which the artistic ambition of the best kind of tragic drama invites us to a place beyond sentimentality, beyond emotion, in a kind of intellectual recognition and superiority of the superiority of the human mind over the world of suffering. I might think in this case of something like Shakespeare's King Lear as a very deeply, as spectacle, yes, as sentimental and emotionally engaging, yes, but ultimately as a confrontation for the viewer, for the reader who's ready to encounter it, a confrontation with the innate tragic experience of human existence, the inescapability of suffering. And that in itself is an invitation to a certain kind of intellectual rising above. That I think that's what Schopenhauer is pointing to. That fits in very neatly with his metaphysics of the will and struggle and strife as a source of disquiet and suffering in this lifetime. He also observes that in drama, the ending is harder than the beginning. Why is this? It's because a story is easy to begin but hard to pay off. The audience is willing to give a great deal of rope, sort of a great deal of line or benefit of the doubt to the author, the dramatist at the beginning, thinking, okay, well, he's setting things up, right? He's giving us these puzzle boxes, but he, the author, has figured out what's in them, and so he's going to be able to pay this off. The payoff is where the audience has high expectations and will be extremely disappointed if they feel they've been cheated. The figure who comes to mind in this regard in our own time is the film director J.J. Abrams, who I think is notorious by this point for the creation of series like Lost or perhaps also The Force Awakens, where he's able to do a great deal of interesting setup that activates our interest, but he's ultimately not able to achieve the payoff that would put us in a satisfying position. With respect to those, we feel like we've been cheated as readers. We've been, as audience, we've been promised a resolution to a puzzle, and then in the end, the director or the writer has to say, well, I don't really know how it ends. I don't have a solution to that. I don't know what those numbers were all about. Right? We feel, well, that was the whole point. There was a promise made, it seems, through the art. That, and I've heard that criticism very often of J.J. Abrams. Perhaps you have the similar thoughts yourself. Schopenhauer also tells us here, a good artist will therefore be able to end what he begins. Right? A poor artist is not able to do so. So it's maybe a way of judging artists. An artist would do sort of the opposite of J.J. Abrams, right? Not begin something unless he was certain he had a conclusion for it. He would have thought it out. And that's something that seems the artist would owe to his audience. The third thing I take from this initial section is Schopenhauer's observation that A novel is better as it focuses more upon the inner and less upon the outer life. We can relate that to this moving from the sort of the spectacle and emotion which satisfies the will to the tragic sensibility which activates the intellect and invites it to engage in an act of self-overcoming. So Schopenhauer here seems to prefer in novels more thought and less action. He says the inner life is what we're interested in. And I'll note here that we may refer specifically to readers and consumers of drama like Schopenhauer, people who are interested in high quality novels, quality defined according to this aesthetic that matches up with Schopenhauer's metaphysics. In bad novels, he says, incident is there of its own account, right? Just because something needs to happen and this is an interesting thing to happen. I think of that as spectacle. Incident is not there for the development of character and of thought, for the ideas. So this may be a particularly intellectual way of thinking about art, but this is what Schopenhauer is giving us here. The job of the author is not to relate great events, not to find a great story to tell us, but to make small events interesting. I like that way of expressing it. It seems to me to be largely correct. I wonder if you guys can think of any examples of this, of literature or cinema recently, which has taken a small event, an ordinary story, and made it profoundly interesting by the way that it's been told, by the way that it connects with the audience. I'd be anxious to hear your thoughts on that in the comments. The next section of this essay is a lengthy set of reflections on the character of history. Schopenhauer is very negative about history. He calls it a sham study. He says it is not and it never can be a science. So we add this to his list of conflicts with Hegel and with the Hegelians. Ultimately, his argument in this section is intended to vindicate Schopenhauer's vision of philosophy as superior to history. So here's what he writes. History, which I like to think of as the contrary of poetry, is for time what geography is for space, and it is no more to be called a science in any strict sense of the word than is geography, because it does not deal with universal truths, but only with particular details. History has always been the favorite study of those who wish to learn something without having to face the effort demanded by any branch of real knowledge, which taxes the intelligence. In our time, history is a favorite pursuit, as witness the numerous books upon the subject which appear every year. If the reader cannot help thinking with me that history is merely the constant recurrence of similar things, just as in a kaleidoscope the same bits of glass are represented, but in different combinations, he will not be able to share all this lively interest, nor, however, will he censure it. But there is a ridiculous and absurd claim, made by many people, to regard history as a part of philosophy, nay, as philosophy itself. They imagine that history can take its place. The preference shown for history by the greater public in all ages may be illustrated by the kind of conversation which is so much in vogue everywhere in society. It generally consists in one person relating something, and then another person relating something else, so that in this way everyone is sure of receiving attention. Both here and in the case of history, it is plain that the mind is occupied with particular details. But as in science, so also in every worthy conversation, the mind rises to the consideration of some general truth. This objection does not, however, deprive history of its value. Human life is short and fleeting, and many millions of individuals share in it who are swallowed by that monster of oblivion which is waiting for them with ever-open jaws. It is thus a very thankworthy task to try to rescue something, the memory of interesting and important events, or the leading features and personages of some epoch, from the general shipwreck of the world. From another point of view, we might look upon history as the sequel to zoology. For while with all other animals it is enough to observe the species, with man, individuals, and therefore individual events, have to be studied, because every man possesses a character as an individual. And since individuals and events are without number or end, an essential imperfection attaches to history. In the study of it, all that a man learns never contributes to lessen that which he has still to learn. With any real science, a perfection of knowledge is, at any rate, conceivable. When we gain access to the histories of China and of India, The endlessness of the subject matter will reveal to us the defects in the study and force our historians to see that the object of science is to recognize the many in the one, to perceive the rules in any given example, and to apply to the life of nations a knowledge of mankind, not to go on counting up facts ad infinitum. There are two kinds of history, the history of politics and the history of literature and art. The one is the history of the will, the other that of the intellect. The first is a tale of woe, even of terror. It is a record of agony, struggle, fraud, and horrible murder en masse. The second is everywhere pleasing and serene, like the intellect when left to itself, even though its path be one of error. Its chief branch is the history of philosophy. This is in fact its fundamental base, and the notes of it are heard even in the other kind of history. These deep tones guide the formation of opinion, and opinion rules the world. Hence philosophy, rightly understood, is a material force of the most powerful kind, though very slow in its working. The philosophy of a period is thus the fundamental base of its history. So, Schopenhauer tells us, history is not real knowledge, and it's not real philosophy. This idea of merging philosophy with history or absorbing philosophy into history is absurd and misguided. Why? Because history deals with particulars. Science and knowledge will be science of abstractions, of universals, we might say. The image I have in my mind here is that history moves about on a 2D plane, right? It can move in the x and the y-axis, but it has no vertical. It has no z-axis to allow it to move up to a higher level of abstraction that would take in all that is lower. That's the act of philosophy and of philosophical reflection and wisdom that I think Schopenhauer is pointing to here. So his peculiar conception of history seems to fit with that type of model. He compares this to popular conversation, right? The historians are similar to the type of shallow conversation one gets at dinner parties where what happens? Everybody gets a turn to speak, right? Everybody gets what they want, which is the attention of everybody else. So I will tell you a story from my vacation, and then I will stop speaking. People will stop paying attention to me and begin paying attention to you while you say something interesting. And we all nod our heads, and we all know this is the social convention, right? I'm allowed to tell my story, but I don't hog the attention. I pass it on to other people, and everybody gets what they want. Well, this, as a model of social engagement, right? Schopenhauer, with his own sort of anti-social practices, might not to think too highly of it, but this sort of works as a model for that type of shallow discourse and conversation. But for true knowledge and wisdom, there has to be something higher than this. There has to be something more important than this kind of shallow vein, taking turns getting attention. Okay. Schopenhauer does say that history has value. Its value is to save something from the maw of oblivion that consumes all of us eventually, to save some of the past, some of the greatness of the past, of the great characters and individuals and stories of the past, from the general shipwreck of the world. I like that expression. I actually went ahead and looked it up in my German copy of Peruga. And Bailey Saunders' translation is identical to the German. Aus dem allgemeinen Schiffbruch der Welt zu retten. So to save just something, anything, some story of Julius Caesar, of Napoleon, of Shakespeare, of some great figure, some little biographical detail can be saved. Well, history is good for that, sort of helping us to carry along the fragments of the past from the shipwreck of the world, the oblivion that consumes all that lives. This great comparison to zoology, I'm going to try to unpack this a little bit for you. He says history can be the sequel to zoology. What does that mean? Zoology, the study of animals and animal life, and there is something uniquely human about history, but it doesn't make it the highest human science or even a science at all. With regard to animals, to know the truth about them, it is enough for us to study the species. So if I want to know about ants, I study ants. I know about this particular subspecies of ant, I study that species of ant. I don't have to go down to study the individual ants except as they are models or examples of the behavior of the entire species. I might put it this way and say that the species being is sufficient for knowledge of animals. Right? So it doesn't matter that I study this dog, this fox or that fox, this beetle or that beetle, provided they're of the same species. The species is what I'm interested in. Individuals are unimportant, or even I might say at some level, some types of animals, just non-existent. They're just manifestations of the species being in a particular form, but there's nothing interesting or unique about them. Okay. Pet owners, don't get angry at me. I have a pet myself. How are humans different? Humans are individuals, right? We have an individual will and an individual intellect, and so to study humanity, one must study the individual events and choices that those individual humans make. This has a couple of consequences. First, it means humans have a history. Unlike animals, to study human beings, you have to study the history of them and their individual choices, their collective and cultural choices and movements. Second, it means that human history is necessarily incomplete. Why incomplete? Incomplete because learning more about humans and their history does not decrease in any way what I still must learn about humans. That they're sort of an infant. They're going to keep on being human individuals, making new and different choices. History will go on. And that means that the task of trying to conduct what I called before a kind of two-dimensional catalog of human history and activity is futile, right? That plane goes off infinitely in every direction. You're never going to comprehend it in that way. You can spend your whole life or many lifetimes adding up all of the different events in that 2D plane. You're never going to achieve any kind of fullness or completeness. So there is a kind of futility to the study of history, as Schopenhauer is describing it here. And the third consequence is that the study of human history is necessarily unscientific. That is, it cannot be a Wissenschaft, in a branch of scholarship which, operating according to disciplined rules, can achieve genuine knowledge. It can't be a science in the old sense. It can never result in a full comprehensive system of knowledge. What can? Well, philosophy can. What's needed here is still a philosophical act, a move into that third dimension, which would allow us to overcome, to assign meaning, my language here, to that whole two-dimensional XY plane of human history. The next section, Reflection on History, Schopenhauer says, let's start over again and say there are two kinds of history. The history of politics, which is the history of will, right? We recognize that as one of the elements of Schopenhauer's metaphysics. Politics is the history of will. It is a story of woe and murder and suffering. The other kind of history is a history of literature and art. This is the history of human intellect. Right away we recognize intellect is going to be the good principle, will, the thing that pulls us down into the realm of strife that involves us more deeply in this world of suffering, the thing that we must overcome if we're ultimately to be wise. Along with this history of the intellect comes a kind of serenity, a kind of peace, which ultimately culminates in the history of philosophy. And here, interestingly, Schopenhauer, I think, has defined history of a philosophy in a way that keeps it quite separate from the type of history that he is criticizing and demeaning earlier in the essay. The great image I love at the end of this section is this idea of philosophy as the bass note, right? The kind of fundamental root sound, very low, very quiet. Perhaps you only hear it in the gaps between other instruments, but it is the bass note of history, running through all history, even the history of murder and woe, the history of politics and will. Even there's a kind of this bass note of philosophy that you can hear if you listen for it, sort of a low hum at the back, right? That's philosophy moving slowly right through this history. So if you want to understand history, you have to have this. You have to understand philosophy as being, in a sense, prior to or above, I might say, this historical sensibility. And this claim, just enigmatic claim, in one sentence, he says, therefore, philosophy is a material force in history, though one that operates very slowly. And I think that's going to be a wonderful thing to think upon, just what he means by that. Philosophy itself, this kind of philosophical wisdom, is not only this bass note that sounds through all of history, the history of art and the history of politics, but it is itself, the progress of ideas is itself a material force, though one that works very, very slowly, like the erosion by wind and rain. in history. He doesn't elaborate what he means by that, but he's Arthur Schopenhauer, and he doesn't have to elaborate. I'd love to spend more time thinking and speculating about just what that might entail. Philosophy as a material force operating in history. I think that's fascinating. Very, very, very fruitful reflections, I think, possible down that line. In the next section, Schopenhauer is going to give us various aphorisms, and I'll just read the entire remainder of the essay in the next section, about the second half of it. Various aphorisms about newspapers and the journalists who write for them, about the idea that the metaphor that a hypothesis is like an organism living in the mind, okay? And some reflections upon similes and upon repetition. So, here's what Schopenhauer writes. The newspaper is the second hand in the clock of history, and it is not only made of baser metal than those which point to the minute and the hour, but it seldom goes right. The so-called leading article is the chorus to the drama of passing events. Exaggeration of every kind is as essential to journalism as it is to the dramatic art, for the object of journalism is to make events go as far as possible. Thus it is that all journalists are, in the very nature of their calling, alarmists, and this is their way of giving interest to what they write. Herein they are like little dogs. If anything stirs, they immediately set up a shrill bark. Therefore, let us carefully regulate the attention to be paid to this trumpet of danger, so that it may not disturb our digestion. Let us recognize that a newspaper is at best but a magnifying glass, and very often merely a shadow on the wall. The pen is to thought what the stick is to walking, but you walk most easily when you have no stick, and you think with the greatest perfection when you have no pen in your hand. It is only when a man begins to be old that he likes to use a stick and is glad to take up his pen. When a hypothesis has once come to birth in the mind, or gained a footing there, it leads a life so far comparable with the life of an organism as that it assimilates matter from the outer world only when it is like in kind with it and beneficial. And when, contrarily, such matter is not like in kind, but hurtful, the hypothesis, equally with the organism, throws it off, or, if forced to take it, gets rid of it again entire. To gain immortality, an author must possess so many excellences that, while it will not be easy to find anyone to understand and appreciate them all, there will be men in every age who are able to recognize and value some of them. In this way, the credit of his book will be maintained throughout the long course of centuries, in spite of the fact that human interests are always changing. An author like this, who has a claim to the continuance of his life even with posterity, can only be a man who, over the wide earth, will seek his like in vain, and offer a palpable contrast with everyone else in virtue of his unmistakable distinction. Nay, more, were he, like the wandering Jew, to live through several generations, he would still remain in the same superior position. If this were not so, it would be difficult to see why his thoughts should not perish like those of other men. Metaphors and similes are of great value, insofar as they explain an unknown relation by a known one. Even the more detailed simile, which grows into a parable or an allegory, is nothing more than the exhibition of some relation in its simplest, most visible and palpable form. The growth of ideas rests at bottom upon similes, because ideas arise by a process of combining the similarities and neglecting the differences between things. Further, intelligence, in the strict sense of the word, ultimately consists in a seizing of relations, and a clear and pure grasp of relations is all the more often attained when the comparison is made between cases that lie wide apart from one another, and between things of quite different nature. As long as a relation is known to me as existing only in a single case, I have but an individual idea of it. In other words, only an intuitive knowledge of it. But as soon as I see the same relation in two different cases, I have a general idea of its whole nature, and this is a deeper and more perfect knowledge. Since then similes and metaphors are such a powerful engine of knowledge, it is a sign of great intelligence in a writer if his similes are unusual and at the same time to the point. Aristotle also observes that by far the most important thing to a writer is to have this power of metaphor, for it is a gift which cannot be acquired, and it is a mark of genius. As regards reading, to require that a man shall retain everything he has ever read is like asking him to carry about with him all that he has ever eaten. The one kind of food has given him bodily and the other mental nourishment, and it is through these two means that he has grown to be what he is. The body assimilates only that which is like it, and so a man retains in his mind only that which interests him, in other words, that which suits his system of thought or his purposes in life. If a man wants to read good books, he must make a point of avoiding bad ones, for life is short, and time and energy limited. Repetitio est mater studiorum. Any book that is at all important ought to be at once read through twice, partly because, on a second reading, the connection of the different portions of the book will be better understood, and the beginning comprehended only when the end is known, and partly because we are not in the same temper and disposition on both readings. On the second perusal, we get a new view of every passage and a different impression of the whole book, which then appears in another light. A man's works are the quintessence of his mind, and even though he may possess a very great capacity, they will always be incomparably more valuable than his conversation. Nay, in all essential matters his works will not only make up for the lack of personal intercourse with him, but they will far surpass it in solid advantages. The writings even of a man of moderate genius may be edifying, worth reading, and instructive, because they are his quintessence, the result and fruit of all his thought and study, whilst conversation with him may be unsatisfactory. So it is that we can read books by men in whose company we find nothing to please, and that a high degree of culture leads us to seek entertainment almost wholly from books and not from men. There are a couple of interesting things in this section. First, this attack upon newspapers and journalists, newspapers as the second hand of the clock of human knowledge, of human culture. The second hand, in a couple of ways, is an important metaphor. It's made of a lower quality metal than the rest of the clock. It is frequently inaccurate, but also, who cares, right? Knowing whether it's, especially on an analog clock of the kind Schopenhauer is thinking of, it doesn't much matter if it's 11 seconds or 14 seconds past the hour. Am I going to go to a lot of trouble to try to correct the clock? Well, no. And that's just the way that we should encounter and think about newspapers and journalism in our overall sort of diet of reading and of gathering knowledge about the world. Low quality, frequently inaccurate, but it really doesn't matter anyway. So journalists he compares to alarmists. Says they're all alarmists, compares them to yappy dogs, small yappy dogs. I have nothing to disagree with, nothing to disagree about there. Next part, I'd like to focus on this idea of the hypothesis as an organism in the mind. And there's an interesting thing here about the psychology of argument for us to draw from. What is this organism like? Once I have a hypothesis in my mind, right, this is the cause of this, what does it do? It does what any living thing does. It assimilates in its environment what is similar to itself, what is good food for it. I think in this case we think of confirmatory evidence, right? If I find something that supports my hypothesis, sort of it reaches out like an amoeba and absorbs that into it and becomes stronger in my mind. But also like an organism, it resists or expels what is unlike itself, what is poisonous to it. And what is this for a hypothesis? That's disconfirming evidence, right? I push that away, right? No, if I'm forced to take it in, I violently expel it. I doubt it. I disbelieve it. I'm incredulous towards it. And I think this interesting metaphor, it helps me to think of an amoeba, right, in its environment, absorbing what it can take and retreating from what it can't. I think we all know cases like this, the way that people think or argue like this. I think that Schopenhauer gives us here a good psychology of people's resistance to argument. A hypothesis is not a thing that people would ordinarily treat as this thing to subject to rigorous testing to try to beat it over the head with disconfirming evidence. Instead, it sort of lives like this amoeba in the mind, seeking to become stronger by attracting what is similar and rejecting what is different from it, a sort of psychology of the hypothesis living in the mind. Okay. Perhaps that's not the way we ought to think, but it is the way that we do, in fact, think, many of us, much of the time. A couple of observations he makes here about immortality for a writer consists in having so many overlapping distinct excellences that no one generation of readers exhausts them all. I think of Shakespeare in this regard, right? There's something deeply satisfying about Shakespeare. There's something excellent about his writing that I don't think his contemporaries or even the 2 or 3 or 5 generations immediately after him were able immediately to grasp. A great thinker, I'll throw Plato and Aristotle here into the mix as well. A great thinker is one in whom succeeding generations find greater and more and new surprising excellences in their work as time goes on. So that they have this kind of inexhaustible array of, say, a dozen or more different axes of excellence, which are discovered over time. This is what maybe makes it what helps to go into making a thinker canonical, we would say, a long-lasting thinker. Then I think the really important part of this final section, these reflections upon simile and metaphor. Okay. Simile, Schopenhauer says, is vital to the growth of ideas. Why? Because our ideas grow. We rise to higher levels of abstraction in our knowledge by combining similarities and by ignoring or minimizing differences. And it's that act of judgment in seeing, these things are similar in a higher way, and these differences between them are relatively unimportant in light of those similarities. That's progress. That's rising to a higher level of abstraction. That's just what we do when we are thinking and advancing in our knowledge. And so this idea of simile and metaphor is vital to that kind of progress of knowledge. Intelligence, he says, consists in grasping similarities across multiple cases. So think of an example. Consider a foal in relation to a horse, a calf in relation to a cow, and a lamb in relation to a sheep. I think of those 3 things. I can see, despite the fact that those animals are quite different from one another, that there are similarities between those relationships. And it's my grasping of those similarities, and it's my knowing that the differences, knowing that one of those animals chews the cud and the other one does, but horses don't. That's not an important difference for me to bring to my generalization to a higher level about the relations between these animals, the parent and the young. So it's that, I think that act of judgment is part of what Schopenhauer is getting at. And so he says it's the mark of an excellent writer that he writes excellent similes. His metaphors are surprising, but always to the point. They are illuminating, but without being cliched, without being predictable. And to be able to do this well, even going back to Aristotle, has been recognized as a mark of genius. A person who can communicate in images the similarities between things that's certainly a person who's worth writing, who's worth reading, who's worth listening to. Okay. He says as well that there's no need for anybody to expect to remember all that they read, like that amoeba in the mind. Just absorb in what you read what is similar to you and let the rest of it pass by. And this final couple of comments at the end, that repetition is the mother of study, that any good book book worthy of being read should be read twice. You will, if it's not worth reading a second time, it may not have been worth reading for the first time. And then finally, sort of rolling back around to Schopenhauer's sort of cultured misanthropy, a man's works are almost always superior to his conversation because they are the essence of his mind. He's been able to put all of his effort into crafting his works and his writing, provided he's not a journalist, right? He's been able to craft these things. And so it's quite possible that even a mediocre and very dull person may actually write an interesting book that's well worth reading. So we can profitably read the books of men whose company we would dislike. And so it is the mark of a more cultured person to prefer books to conversation, to prefer books to men, as Schopenhauer puts it. And there we are back to this idea of this kind of higher intellectual, sort of bookish misanthropy that Schopenhauer carries through all of these later essays. That's the end of my comments on this chapter. The next section of The Art of Literature is titled On Criticism, and we'll look at that one in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.